I woke up this morning to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside my window. When I rushed to look, my heart nearly stopped. Three massive bulldozers were completely blocking the driveway to my farm. Behind them stood Karen, our HOA president, clutching a stack of papers with the most smug smile I've ever seen. "You violated HOA regulations," she announced triumphantly. "This driveway is now under our control." I tried desperately to reason with her. What regulations? This is private property. Karen simply ignored me, turning to the bulldozer operators. "Start demolition immediately," she ordered with a wave of her hand. My blood boiled as I watched this unfold. I needed to act fast. But Karen had no idea that I actually owned this entire area, including the very ground she was standing on. Let me take you back a bit, so you understand what led to this ridiculous standoff. My name is James Miller, and this farm has been in my family for 5 generations. My great-great-grandfather built this place with his bare hands back in 1897, and it's been passed down from father to son ever since. I've lived here my entire life. The smell of fresh hay in the morning, the sound of roosters at dawn, the taste of vegetables straight from the garden, these simple pleasures are what make life worth living for me. I never wanted anything fancy or complicated. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of working the land my ancestors tended before me. What most people don't know, including Karen and her precious HOA, is that my family actually owns not just this farm, but nearly 200 acres surrounding it. My grandfather was smart with his investments, buying up land whenever it became available. When developers came in the 1980s to build the suburban community that now borders my property, they purchased a portion of our land. But the contract explicitly stated that while houses could be built there, the original family would maintain ownership of all common areas and access roads. I never flaunted this fact. Why would I? I'm not the type to lord power over others. I simply wanted to live and let live, allowing the suburban community to flourish while I maintained my family's agricultural traditions. Enter Karen Williams, newly elected HOA president of Sunnyside Estates. From the moment she took office 6 months ago, it was clear she had grand ambitions. Her campaign promised to elevate community standards and enforce regulations that had been neglected for too long. What that actually meant was a reign of petty tyranny that has made everyone's lives miserable. First came the ridiculous rules. All houses must be painted from an approved color palette of 3 nearly identical beige shades. Then, residents were forbidden from planting any vegetation not on the approved plants. A list that, unsurprisingly, excluded nearly all food-producing plants. Security cameras had to be a specific brand and model. Holiday decorations were restricted to exactly 14 days before and 3 days after any given holiday. People complained, of course, but Karen had stacked the HOA board with her friends. Anyone who spoke against her at meetings was quickly silenced or dismissed. Fines began piling up for the most minor infractions. A trash can left out an hour too long, grass half an inch above regulation height, or a non-approved welcome mat. I watched all this from a distance, thankful that my farm was technically outside HOA jurisdiction. Or so I thought. 3 weeks ago, I received my first letter from Karen. The envelope bore the official HOA logo, and inside was a formal notice claiming my agricultural activities were negatively impacting property values. The letter demanded I cease unsightly farming operations visible from Sunnyside Estates and conform to community standards. I laughed and threw it away. A week later, another letter arrived, this one threatening fines, then another and another. each more threatening than the last. I consulted my lawyer, who assured me they had no jurisdiction over my property. I figured they'd eventually realize their mistake and back off. Yesterday, the final letter arrived, stating that the HOA board had voted unanimously to reclaim the access road leading to your property as it constitutes a community eyesore. I didn't take it seriously. How could I? They had absolutely no legal right to my driveway. And yet, here we are, 3 bulldozers blocking my only access road, threatening my livelihood. This isn't just about convenience. I have crops that need to be transported, deliveries scheduled, and livestock that require regular veterinary visits. Without that driveway, my entire operation grinds to a halt. What Karen doesn't understand is that she's not just attacking my property, she's attacking my heritage, my family's legacy, and my very way of life. The farm isn't just land and buildings to me. It's the physical embodiment of generations of hard work and sacrifice. As I stood there watching Karen smugly direct those bulldozers, something inside me snapped. I realized I couldn't be passive anymore. Karen and her HOA had gone too far, and it was time to show them exactly who they were messing with. The standoff at my driveway was just the beginning of Karen's reign of terror. After our initial confrontation, I retreated to my farmhouse to call my lawyer, hoping to resolve this madness quickly. But Karen wasn't about to let a little thing like the law stand in her way. That very afternoon, a courier delivered a stack of violation notices, each in its own official-looking envelope, with the HOA logo prominently displayed. I tore open the first one, my hands shaking with disbelief. Violation: property aesthetics below community standards. Fine: $500 day until rectified. The second notice was even more absurd. Violation: unapproved fence coloration. Fine: $350 day until painted to approved specification desert sandstone #7. I couldn't believe my eyes as I continued reading through the pile. Violation: unauthorized agricultural activity visible from community spaces. Fine: $750 day. Violation: excessive vegetation height. Fine: $200 day. Violation: unapproved vehicle storage tractor. Fine: $400 day. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, Karen had invented over $2,500 in daily fines for a property that wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. The final letter was the most outrageous. Failure to remedy all violations within 72 hours will result in HOA-authorized demolition of non-compliant structures. They were threatening to bulldoze my barn, my grandfather's workshop, the greenhouse where my mother had taught me to grow tomatoes, everything. The next morning, I decided to try reasoning with Karen one more time. I walked down to where the bulldozers remained parked across my driveway, blocking any vehicles from entering or leaving my property. Karen was there, clipboard in hand, directing a crew that was now setting up orange construction barriers. "Karen," I called out, keeping my voice as calm and reasonable as possible. "We need to talk about this. My property isn't part of the HOA. These fines, these threats, none of this is legal." She turned to me with that same smug smile. "Oh, James, you're confused. Your driveway crosses through HOA common space. That makes your entire property subject to our regulations." I took a deep breath. "That's simply not true. I have the property deeds and—" "Save it for court," she interrupted, waving dismissively. "Though I doubt you can afford the legal fees on top of all these fines you're accumulating." "This is harassment," I insisted. "You know you don't have jurisdiction here." Karen's smile vanished. "Officer," she called out, and to my shock, a police cruiser I hadn't noticed pulled up. This man is trespassing on HOA property and threatening me. The young officer approached, looking uncomfortable. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is my property, I protested, pulling out my phone. I can show you the deed right now, Karen interrupted, thrusting a folder of documents at the officer. These are the official HOA boundaries. Officer, as you can see, this area falls under our jurisdiction. I glimpsed the papers. They were clearly altered. Someone had extended the HOA boundary lines to encompass my entire farm. But before I could point this out, Karen continued her performance. He's been hostile and threatening, she told the officer, her voice trembling with fake fear. I don't feel safe with him here. The officer, clearly out of his depth with property disputes, suggested I leave the area to de-escalate the situation and handle this through proper legal channels. Fuming but realizing I wouldn't get anywhere, I retreated back to my house. As word of the dispute spread through the neighborhood, people began taking sides. My phone rang constantly that afternoon. First was old Miss S. Jenkins from down the road. James, this is outrageous. Karen's gone power mad. Half the neighborhood is furious about what she's doing to you. That was somewhat comforting, but the next call deflated my hope. James, it's Mike from across the street. Look, buddy, nothing personal, but that farm of yours does bring down property values. Maybe it's time to sell and move somewhere more rural. By evening, 2 distinct camps had formed. Several neighbors brought food and offered support, sharing their own horror stories about Karen's HOA tyranny. Others drove by slowly, giving me disapproving looks, clearly buying into Karen's narrative that I was some kind of rule-breaking menace. The next morning brought the worst escalation yet. I awoke to the sound of not 3, but 5 bulldozers. Karen had called in reinforcements. A crew was measuring and marking areas of my driveway, and to my horror, they had moved beyond it and were now placing stakes on my actual farmland. I rushed outside in my bathrobe. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen stood with a group of HOA board members, all wearing matching polo shirts with the Sunnyside Estates logo. We're marking the area for the new community park, she announced proudly. It's going to have a playground, walking paths, and a lovely reflection pond. On my land? I was shouting now, beyond any attempt at diplomacy. Karen pulled out a document and waved it triumphantly. Not anymore. According to this agreement you signed, you've donated this portion of your property to the HOA for community use. I snatched the paper from her hand. There, at the bottom, was what appeared to be my signature clearly forged on a document transferring 5 acres of my family's land to the HOA. This is fraud, I exploded. I never signed this. Karen simply smiled. The board has already accepted your generous donation. The bulldozers start work in 1 hour. In that moment, something inside me changed. I had tried reason. I had tried patience. I had tried playing by the rules. But Karen had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was attempting to steal my family's legacy through outright fraud. I turned and walked back to my house, my mind racing. The time for diplomacy was over. Karen Williams had no idea who she was really dealing with, or what was about to hit her. I spent that night pacing my farmhouse, rage and determination coursing through my veins. The sight of Karen waving that forged document had ignited something primal within me. This was no longer about neighborhood politics. This was about defending my family's legacy against a criminal assault. By sunrise, I had formulated my plan. My first call was to Thomas Harrington, an old law school friend of my cousin's who specialized in property disputes. I'd met him at family gatherings, but never imagined I'd need his services. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and emphatic. "James, what they're doing isn't just inappropriate, it's criminal," Thomas said, his voice tight with professional indignation. "Forgery, fraud, criminal trespass, attempted theft of property. We're talking about serious offenses here." "Can you help me?" I asked, desperation evident in my voice. "I'll be there this afternoon," he promised. "And James, don't engage with them again until I arrive. Document everything. Take photos, record any interactions, but keep your distance." I spent the morning following his advice, photographing the bulldozers, the stakes they'd driven into my land, and the barricades blocking my driveway. From my upstairs window, I could see Karen directing her minions like a field general, pointing and gesturing as they prepared to carve up my property. Thomas arrived at 2 o'clock, navigating his sleek BMW around the blockade by driving through my neighbor's yard, Miss S. Jenkins had happily granted permission when I called to explain. He wasn't alone. A paralegal and a land surveyor accompanied him. "First things first," Thomas said, spreading out documents across my kitchen table. "Let's establish exactly what you own." For the next 3 hours, we pored over property deeds, historical records, and the original contracts from when my grandfather had sold portions of our land to the developers. The surveyor matched these against county records and GPS coordinates. What emerged was crystal clear and far more powerful than I had imagined. "James," Thomas said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "do you understand what these documents show?" I shook my head, overwhelmed by the legal terminology. "Your grandfather was a very shrewd businessman. When he sold the land for development, he retained mineral rights, access rights, and most importantly ownership of all common areas, which he then leased to the HOA on a 40-year renewable contract." My breath caught. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Thomas said, leaning forward, "that you don't just own your farm. You own the parks, the community center, the swimming pool, the tennis courts, every common area in Sunnyside Estates. The HOA has been leasing them from your family all these years." I sat back, stunned. "And the lease?" "Expires next month," Thomas confirmed, tapping a clause in the contract, "with an option for you to renew or not, at your sole discretion." A plan began forming in my mind, but Thomas wasn't finished. "There's more. This forged document?" He held up Karen's fraudulent land transfer. "This is actionable. We can file criminal charges against whoever created this. And these fines they're issuing? Completely unenforceable. Your property isn't subject to HOA regulations, never has been." By evening, our strategy was set. Thomas filed emergency injunctions to halt any construction or blockade on my property. He submitted formal complaints of forgery and fraud to the district attorney's office. And most devastatingly, he prepared a notice informing the HOA that I would be exercising my right not to renew their lease on the common areas. The sheriff arrived the next morning, injunction in hand, ordering the bulldozers removed from my driveway immediately. Karen was livid, her face contorted with fury as she waved her folder of documents at the officers. "We have every right to be here," she shrieked. "The HOA voted unanimously." "Ma'am," the sheriff said calmly, "this court order says otherwise. Your equipment needs to be moved now, or it will be impounded at your expense." As the bulldozers grudgingly backed away, Thomas handed Karen a thick envelope. "You've been served," he said simply. "Mr. Miller is filing suit against the HOA and against you personally for harassment, trespass, attempted theft of property, and fraud. Karen's face drained of color as she skimmed the documents. "This is ridiculous," she stammered. "The board will fight this all the way." "I doubt that," Thomas replied coolly. "Especially once they see this." He handed her another document, the notice regarding the common area's lease. I watched as comprehension dawned on Karen's face. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. She knew her power was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. Word spread quickly through Sunnyside Estates. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from HOA board members, suddenly eager to clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding. Several neighbors stopped by, offering support and sharing their own horror stories about Karen's reign of terror. The emergency HOA meeting called that evening was held in the community center, a building that, as everyone now knew, I technically owned. I decided to attend, Thomas at my side. The room fell silent as we entered, all eyes turning to us. Karen sat at the head table, her usual smugness replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. "Before we begin," Thomas announced, "my client would like to address the community." I stood, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. For a moment, I considered unleashing all my pent-up anger. But looking at their faces, my neighbors, many of whom were decent people, manipulated by Karen's regime, I chose a different approach. "I've lived alongside this community my entire life," I began, my voice steady. "My family has been here for 5 generations. We've always valued being good neighbors. When my grandfather sold the land that became Sunnyside Estates, he envisioned a harmonious relationship between the farm and the development." I paused, looking directly at Karen. "Unfortunately, recent actions by your HOA president have damaged that relationship. She has attempted to seize my property through fraud, harassment, and intimidation. She has issued illegal fines, forged documents, and trespassed on land that has been in my family for over a century." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several board members glared at Karen, who seemed to shrink in her chair. I could, legally, choose not to renew the lease for all common areas when it expires next month. I continued. "That would mean the parks, the pool, the tennis courts, this very community center, all would revert to my sole control." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Karen half rose from her seat, then collapsed back down as Thomas placed a restraining hand on her arm. "But that's not what I want," I said, raising my voice above the din. "What I want is what my grandfather wanted to be: good neighbors. So I'm offering a new arrangement. I will renew the lease, but with new terms. The HOA will continue to manage these areas, but with oversight from a community council that includes non-HOA residents. And Karen Williams will resign from the board, effective immediately." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of my neighbors. "The choice is yours. Continue down this path of harassment and lose everything, or work with me to create the community we all deserve." The vote was immediate and nearly unanimous. Karen sat frozen, watching as her empire crumbled around her. When the new board president, elected on the spot, asked her to surrender her HOA credentials, she couldn't even speak. She simply placed her badge and keys on the table and walked out, defeated and humiliated. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors lined up to shake my hand, apologize for not standing up sooner, and thank me for my restraint. I felt no triumph, only relief that justice had prevailed and hope that genuine community might now have a chance to flourish. Walking back to my farm that evening, I noticed Karen's car still in the parking lot. She sat inside, staring blankly ahead, the embodiment of power corrupted and destroyed by its own excess. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The weeks following the emergency HOA meeting unfolded with a satisfying sense of justice being served. Thomas, my attorney, pursued the lawsuit against both the HOA and Karen personally with methodical precision. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, fabricated violations, illegal blockades, and attempted property theft. There was no defense that could withstand the mountain of documentation we had assembled. The court proceedings were mercifully brief. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years on the bench, listened to both sides before delivering her verdict with cutting clarity. This court finds the actions of Sunnyside Estates HOA and Karen Williams to constitute harassment, fraud, and attempted theft of property, she declared, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. The HOA is hereby ordered to pay damages in the amount of $175,000 to Mr. Miller, plus all legal fees. Additionally, Miss Williams is permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board in this county. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. When the gavel fell, finalizing the judgment, she let out a strangled sound, half sob, half scream, before storming out of the courtroom. The new HOA board, eager to distance themselves from Karen's regime, issued a formal apology that was delivered to every home in the neighborhood. They also installed a commemorative bench at the edge of my property with a plaque that read, "In honor of the Miller family, whose stewardship of this land reminds us to respect history and property rights." 3 days after the court ruling, a moving truck appeared outside Karen's house. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching with undisguised satisfaction as her belongings were loaded up. I was working in my garden when she emerged for the final time, car keys in hand. Our eyes met across the distance. For a moment, I thought she might approach to apologize, perhaps, or to hurl one final insult. Instead, she simply turned away, shoulders slumped in defeat, and drove off without a backward glance. That Saturday, Miss S. Jenkins organized a community barbecue on my property, the first of many such gatherings. Neighbors I'd barely known before brought dishes, drinks, and stories to share. Children played in the fields where bulldozers had threatened to destroy my heritage. The atmosphere was one of genuine community, not the forced conformity Karen had tried to impose, but a natural coming together of people with mutual respect. As twilight settled over the farm, Mike, the neighbor who had once suggested I sell my property, approached me with an extended hand and a sheepish smile. "I was wrong," he admitted, clapping me on the shoulder. "This place isn't lowering our property values, it's the heart and soul of this neighborhood. Thanks for fighting for it." I looked around at my land, the weathered barn, the flourishing fields, the ancient oak trees that had witnessed 5 generations of my family's story, and felt a profound sense of peace. My driveway was clear, my property secure, and my rights respected. "To James!" someone shouted, raising a glass. "The man who taught us all that you don't mess with a farmer and his land." Glasses clinked amid laughter and cheers. And somewhere, I like to imagine, Karen was unpacking boxes in a neighborhood with no HOA, learning a lesson that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some people aren't meant to be bullied. Have you ever encountered a Karen like the one in our story? The entitlement, the power trips, the blatant disregard for others' rights, these characters exist beyond fiction, lurking in neighborhoods across the country. Perhaps you've faced your own HOA nightmare, or stood up to someone who tried to bully you out of what was rightfully yours. I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Did you stand your ground like our farmer hero? Or do you wish you had handled things differently? Maybe you're even part of an HOA board that strives to be fair and supportive. We'd welcome that perspective too. Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating real-life dramas that will have you cheering for justice. Your support keeps these stories coming, and who knows, your own tale of triumph over tyranny might be featured next. Hit that notification bell, share with friends who've dealt with difficult neighbors, and join our community of everyday heroes standing up for what's right.